Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
I thought a vacation in Tahiti with my family would be a dream come true, but it turned into a nightmare of constant complaints and arguments. When they pushed me too far, I made a decision that shocked even me. I left them stranded without money and flew home alone. And honestly, it was the best choice I ever made. The idea to take my family to Tahiti had been simmering in my mind for years. I'd always dreamed of visiting those postcard-perfect bungalows perched over turquoise lagoons, and I thought, why not make it a family experience? After all, life is short, and this was the kind of memory I wanted us to cherish forever. When I revealed my plan during a family dinner, the reaction was everything I'd hoped for. My mom gasped, clutching her chest dramatically. "You're taking us to Tahiti?" she exclaimed. My dad, ever the skeptic, asked if I'd won the lottery. My younger siblings, Lisa, who was 24, and Ryan, who was 19, immediately started Googling the island on their phones, throwing out excited suggestions for activities. Their joy was infectious, and in that moment, all the sacrifices I'd made to save for the trip felt worth it. I'd worked extra shifts, skipped vacations for myself, and budgeted carefully for over 2 years to pull this off. Their gratitude made me feel like the best sibling in the world. Little did I know that feeling wouldn't last. We arrived in Tahiti on a sunny afternoon, the kind that felt like it had been stolen from a dream. The resort was even more stunning than the pictures, with its sprawling wooden docks leading to private bungalows surrounded by clear blue water. The first 2 days were everything I'd hoped for. Mornings were spent snorkeling, with my mom squealing every time a fish got too close. My dad, surprisingly adventurous, decided to try paddleboarding, which ended with him falling into the water more times than I could count. Lisa was glued to her phone, taking Instagram-worthy selfies at every turn, while Ryan acted like a hyperactive kid, darting from one activity to the next. In those moments, I felt like the hero of the family. "Thank you so much for this," my mom said one evening as we sat on the deck, watching the sunset. Lisa and Ryan nodded in agreement, and my dad even raised his glass of local rum in a rare show of appreciation. I went to bed that night thinking I'd finally done something truly meaningful for my family. But by the third day, the magic began to fade, and the cracks in our picture-perfect vacation started to show. It began subtly, almost innocently. Lisa complained about the food during breakfast. "I thought the food here would be more exotic," she said, pushing her plate away. "This just tastes like overpriced hotel food." Ryan grumbled about the heat when we took a short hike to a nearby waterfall. "Why did you pick this hike?" he muttered under his breath. "It's so basic. I saw cooler ones on TikTok." Even my mom started nitpicking. She didn't like the firmness of the bed in the bungalow and kept saying the resort should offer softer pillows. "For what this place costs, you'd think they'd have better amenities," she quipped. At first, I brushed off their complaints, chalking them up to minor travel fatigue. But as the day wore on, their comments grew more frequent and more entitled. The real turning point came when we sat down to discuss our plans for the next day. I'd booked a boat tour to explore some of the smaller islands around Tahiti, complete with snorkeling stops and a picnic on a secluded beach. I thought they'd be excited, but instead, I was met with groans. "Do we have to spend all day on a boat?" Lisa whined. "Can't we just chill at the pool?" "I barely got any sun today." Ryan chimed in, "Yeah, and I wanted to check out that jet ski thing." "A boat tour sounds boring." My mom, ever the peacemaker, tried to soften the blow. "Maybe we could do something less structured? Something more relaxing." I felt a pang of frustration. "I've already paid for the tour," I said, trying to keep my tone even. "It's supposed to be one of the best ways to see the islands." "That's nice," Lisa said, not looking up from her phone, "but it's not really what I'm in the mood for." That night, I couldn't shake the sinking feeling that my family didn't appreciate the effort I'd put into planning this trip. I lay awake, replaying the day's events in my head. Was I overreacting, or were they truly being ungrateful? By morning, I decided to give them the benefit of the doubt. Maybe they just needed a bit more input in the plans. Over breakfast, I asked if there were any specific activities they'd like to do. "Well, I saw this luxury spa on TikTok," Lisa said, her face lighting up. "Can we go there?" "I want to rent a jet ski," Ryan said firmly. My mom added, "I'd love a shopping day at the resort. Just something easy." I glanced at my dad, who shrugged. "Whatever they want is fine with me." It became clear that they weren't interested in the activities I'd planned. They wanted me to bankroll their whims instead. I felt a spark of resentment flare up. This was supposed to be a shared experience, something we all enjoyed together. Instead, they were treating me like their personal concierge. As I sat there, listening to them rattle off their demands, I realized that this trip wasn't turning out the way I'd imagined. The gratitude and joy I'd felt in the beginning were slipping away, replaced by a growing sense of disappointment. I didn't say anything, but a small voice in the back of my mind whispered, "This isn't what you signed up for." At that moment, I didn't realize just how far I'd go to reclaim my peace. But the seeds of my escape had been planted. The shift from gratitude to entitlement was subtle at first, almost unnoticeable. It started with small comments here and there, the kind you'd expect from any group adjusting to a new place. Lisa, my sister, was the first to voice her dissatisfaction. At breakfast on the third day, she poked at her plate of tropical fruit and croissants with a look of disdain. "Is this it?" she asked, lifting a piece of papaya like it had offended her. "I thought the food here would be more authentic. Aren't we supposed to be eating like local cuisine or something?" I blinked. "Lisa, it's a breakfast buffet. You can pick whatever you want. There's an entire station for traditional Tahitian dishes right over there." She rolled her eyes. "Yeah, but it's not really authentic. It feels so watered down, like they're catering to tourists." The irony of her complaint, delivered while sitting in a luxury resort in Tahiti, sipping a mimosa, wasn't lost on me. I tried to laugh it off, but her comment stuck in my mind. My dad was the next to join the chorus of complaints. Later that day, I suggested a short hike to a viewpoint that promised breathtaking views of the island. It was an easy trail, nothing strenuous, and I thought it would be a fun way to explore more of the area. I don't know," Dad said, leaning back in his chair with a frown. "It sounds kind of tame. Don't they have something more adventurous? Like ziplining or parasailing?" "You barely wanted to get out of the bungalow yesterday," I pointed out, trying to keep my tone light. "I figured this would be a nice, low-key activity for everyone." "Low-key is just another word for boring," he grumbled. "I came here to experience something exciting, not to walk around and look at trees." I bit my tongue, reminding myself that he probably didn't mean to sound ungrateful. But a seed of irritation had already taken root. The complaints snowballed from there. My mom, who had been the most enthusiastic about the trip initially, started dropping hints about wanting a real vacation experience, code for expensive spa treatments and cocktails by the pool. "You know, they have this couple's massage package that looks amazing," she said as we passed the spa on our way to dinner one evening. "It's a little pricey, but I think I deserve it after all the stress of planning this trip." I nearly tripped over my own feet. "You mean the trip I planned?" I asked, trying to keep the edge out of my voice. "Well, yes," she said with a wave of her hand. "But you know how much work it's been for me to coordinate everything once we got here. It's exhausting trying to keep everyone happy." I stared at her, speechless. Trying to keep everyone happy? I thought. Was she serious? I was the one who'd planned the itinerary, paid for the flights and accommodations, and covered every meal and activity so far. The only thing my mom had done was complain about the firmness of the pillows and the lack of options on the dessert menu. The tipping point came when my brother, Ryan, pulled me aside after dinner one night. "Hey, I've been thinking," he said, his tone casual. "You should book me a private jet ski tour tomorrow. I saw the one they offer here, but it's a group thing, and I don't want to share with a bunch of strangers." "Are you kidding me?" I asked, narrowing my eyes. "Ryan, do you have any idea how much those private tours cost?" He shrugged. "You can afford it. I mean, you paid for this whole trip, right? What's one more thing?" The entitlement in his voice made my blood boil. I couldn't believe how far we'd strayed from the gratitude and excitement they'd shown when I first announced the trip. It was like they'd forgotten I was doing this out of the kindness of my heart, not because I owed them anything. By the end of the day, I felt like I was walking on eggshells. Every suggestion I made was met with rolled eyes or complaints, and any attempt to compromise only seemed to make things worse. "We could try the lagoon tour tomorrow," I suggested over breakfast the next morning. "It's supposed to be beautiful, and it's only a half-day trip, so we'll still have time to relax after." Lisa groaned. "Another boat ride? Pass." Ryan muttered something under his breath about how boring it sounded, and my mom didn't even look up from her phone. I felt the frustration bubbling up inside me. "You know, this was supposed to be a trip we all enjoyed together," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "But if you guys don't want to do anything I planned, maybe you should figure out your own activities." They all looked at me like I'd just spoken another language. My mom frowned. "Why are you being so sensitive? We're just giving feedback." "Feedback?" I repeated, my voice rising. "All I've heard from you guys for the past 2 days is complaining. Nothing I suggest is good enough. Do you even realize how much time and money I've put into this trip?" For a moment, there was silence. Then Lisa rolled her eyes. "Oh, relax. You're the one who wanted to plan everything. It's not our fault if some of it doesn't work for us. That was the moment I realized I wasn't just irritated, I was angry. They didn't see me as a sibling or a son. They saw me as an ATM with a passport. Someone whose sole purpose was to fund their perfect vacation while they sat back and criticized every detail. I went to bed that night feeling more alone than I ever had in my own family. The resentment that had been building over the past few days was now a full-blown storm, and I knew something had to change. I just didn't realize how far I'd go to make it happen. By the time the 5th day of our trip rolled around, I was holding on to my patience by a thread. Every moment of this vacation felt like walking through quicksand. No matter how hard I tried to make it enjoyable for everyone, their complaints and demands just dragged me down. But I still clung to the hope that the catamaran excursion I'd planned would turn things around. The excursion was a highlight of the trip, complete with everything you'd expect from a tropical getaway. Snorkeling in pristine waters, a barbecue lunch on a secluded beach, and breathtaking views of the island. I'd booked it months in advance, imagining it as the perfect bonding experience for our family. But as we arrived at the dock that morning, I could already sense their reluctance. "This is going to take all day?" my mom asked, crossing her arms as she stared at the boat. "I wanted to go shopping at the resort. They have those cute boutique stores, remember? Do we really have to do this?" Lisa groaned, barely looking up from her phone. "Can't we just chill by the pool? It's so much easier." Ryan, who had been sulking all morning because I refused to book him a private jet ski tour, added, "Yeah, I'm not really feeling this either. It sounds boring." I stared at them, my frustration boiling over. "Are you serious right now? This is one of the best-rated activities on the island. I thought you'd actually enjoy it." My mom shrugged. "Well, it's just not what I had in mind for today. Can't we do something else?" In that moment, something inside me snapped. Weeks of planning, years of saving, and days of enduring their ingratitude all came crashing down. I looked around at the catamaran crew, the other passengers boarding the boat, and my family, who stood there looking as if I'd dragged them to a tax seminar instead of a luxury excursion. "You know what?" I said, my voice shaking with barely contained anger. "I'm done. I'm done trying to make this trip perfect for you. If you don't want to enjoy it, that's your problem, not mine." My mom's eyes widened. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the fact that no matter what I do, it's never good enough for you," I shot back. "I planned this whole trip, paid for everything, and all you've done is complain. Well, I'm done bending over backward for you. Figure out what you want to do on your own." Lisa looked up from her phone, her mouth slightly open in shock. "You don't have to be so dramatic," she said. "Dramatic?" I laughed bitterly. "You've been whining about everything since we got here. The food, the activities, even the bungalow. You act like I dragged you to some rundown motel instead of a 5-star resort in Tahiti. If anyone's being dramatic, it's you." Ryan muttered something under his breath, and I rounded on him. "And you, do you have any idea how entitled you sound? Demanding a private jet ski tour, like I'm your personal ATM? Newsflash, this isn't your trip. It's ours. Or at least it was supposed to be." My family stood there in stunned silence, the sound of waves lapping against the dock filling the space between us. The other passengers on the catamaran were clearly trying not to eavesdrop, but I could see a few sympathetic glances in my direction. Finally, my dad spoke up. "Look, we didn't mean to upset you. We didn't realize you felt this way." I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "Of course you didn't. You've been too busy complaining to notice. And honestly, I don't think you care." Without waiting for a response, I turned to the boat crew and said, "I'm sorry, but we're not going on the excursion." They nodded politely, though I could see the confusion in their eyes. I didn't care. I wasn't going to spend a day on a boat, pretending everything was fine while my family sulked and rolled their eyes. As we walked back to the resort, the tension was palpable. My mom tried to make small talk, but I wasn't in the mood. Lisa and Ryan stayed glued to their phones, and my dad stayed silent, probably sensing that anything he said would only make things worse. When we got back to the bungalow, I went straight to my room and shut the door. I needed space, time to think about what had just happened. For the first time since the trip began, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of my frustration and disappointment. This vacation was supposed to be a dream come true, a chance to bond with my family and create memories we'd cherish forever. Instead, it had become a nightmare of entitlement, ingratitude, and constant criticism. As I lay there, staring at the ceiling, one thought kept running through my mind. I can't do this anymore. Something had to change, and if my family wasn't willing to appreciate what I'd done for them, maybe it was time to stop trying altogether. Little did I know, the breaking point I'd just reached was only the beginning. The decision I'd make next would change everything. I realized then that something had to give. I couldn't spend another moment on this trip trying to cater to people who didn't appreciate me. For days, I tried to convince myself that things would get better, that if I planned just one more perfect activity or said just the right thing, they'd finally see the effort I was putting in. But now I knew better. I needed to leave. The idea hit me like a lightning bolt, and once it settled in my mind, I couldn't shake it. I knew it sounded extreme, but I was done. Done with the constant criticism, done with the entitlement, and done with feeling like an outsider in my own family. Quietly, I got out of bed and grabbed my laptop. Sitting cross-legged on the floor, I started searching for flights. My heart pounded as I scrolled through the options, feeling both exhilarated and nervous. It was late, but there was a direct flight leaving the next morning. I booked it on the spot. Next, I reserved a room at a nearby hotel for the night. My plan was simple. I'd check out of the bungalow early, head to the hotel to regroup, and then catch my flight home. By the time my family realized I was gone, I'd already be thousands of miles away. Part of me felt guilty as I finalized the arrangements. I wasn't the type of person who usually ran away from problems, and the thought of leaving my family stranded in Tahiti felt like something out of a bad movie. But another part of me felt liberated, ecstatic, even. This wasn't just about escaping the vacation from hell. It was about reclaiming my peace and finally putting myself first. For years, I'd been the dependable sibling, the one who always stepped up to help no matter what. And for what? To be treated like a glorified ATM? That was the last straw. I deserved better. I spent the rest of the night quietly packing my bags. I was careful not to make any noise, glancing over my shoulder every few minutes to make sure no one was coming. The bungalow's layout worked in my favor. My room was at the far end, away from the living area where my family was still hanging out. By the time I was finished, it was nearly midnight. I lay down for a few hours, but didn't sleep much. My mind was racing, alternating between excitement and anxiety. What if they woke up early and caught me leaving? What if the flight got delayed? What if this whole plan backfired, and I ended up regretting everything? But as the first hints of dawn began to light up the horizon, my doubts faded. I was ready. At 6 a.m., I slipped out of my room, carrying my suitcase as quietly as I could. My family was still asleep, and the bungalow was eerily quiet. For a moment, I hesitated, looking back at the closed doors to their rooms. Was I really doing this? Then I remembered the catamaran fiasco, Lisa's complaints about the food, Ryan's ridiculous jet ski demand, my mom's constant pressure for spa treatments. The resentment bubbled back to the surface, and I turned away. Before leaving, I wrote a short note and left it on the kitchen counter. I've had enough. Enjoy the rest of the trip without me. Everything's covered through the end of the week. Love. My name. I made one last check to ensure I had everything: wallet, passport, credit cards. The last thing I needed was to be stuck in Tahiti without my essentials. Then, with a deep breath, I walked out the door and into the warm morning air. I took a taxi to the nearby hotel, where I checked in and spent a few hours decompressing. It felt surreal, sitting in a quiet room by myself, knowing that I was finally free from the chaos of the past week. I didn't even turn on the TV or scroll through my phone. I just sat there, relishing the peace and quiet. When it was time to head to the airport, I felt a sense of calm that I hadn't experienced in days. As I boarded the plane and settled into my seat, I couldn't help but smile. It wasn't just about leaving Tahiti. It was about leaving behind the toxic dynamic that had been dragging me down. And as the plane took off, I felt lighter than I had in years. Of course, I didn't leave my family completely stranded. I'd made sure the resort stay was fully paid for through the end of the week, and I left a small amount of cash with the front desk to cover any basic expenses. They weren't going to be homeless or starving. But beyond that, they were on their own. For the first time in what felt like forever, I was putting myself first. And honestly, it felt incredible. The morning of my departure felt surreal, like I was moving through a dream. My alarm buzzed softly at 5 a.m., and I quickly silenced it, not wanting to risk waking anyone up. The faint light of dawn filtered through the bungalow's shutters as I got dressed and double-checked my suitcase one last time. Wallet, passport, credit cards, all there. My heart pounded as I tiptoed through the living area. My family's bedrooms were quiet, their doors closed, and I could hear the soft hum of the ceiling fan in the background. I left the note on the dining table, right where I knew they'd see it. For a moment, I stood there, staring at it, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and apprehension. I've had enough. Enjoy the rest of the trip without me. Love. My name. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything I hadn't been able to say out loud. With one final glance around the room, I grabbed my suitcase and slipped out the door. The air outside was cool and quiet, the resort still waking up for the day. My footsteps echoed on the wooden dock as I walked toward the taxi stand, the sound punctuated by the gentle lapping of water against the bungalows. It felt like I was walking away from more than just a vacation. I was walking away from weeks, months, maybe even years of being taken for granted. When the taxi pulled up, the driver gave me a curious look. "Leaving early, huh?" he asked, his accent soft but distinct. "Yeah," I said, climbing into the back seat. "Change of plans?" He nodded and didn't press further, for which I was grateful. As we drove toward the airport, I couldn't help but laugh quietly to myself. The absurdity of the situation was almost too much. I was leaving my family stranded in Tahiti, a scenario that sounded more like the plot of a sitcom than something that could happen in real life. The driver glanced at me in the rearview mirror. "Something funny?" "Just thinking about how crazy life can be," I said, shaking my head. He chuckled. "You're not wrong." The airport was quiet when I arrived, the morning rush yet to begin. I checked in for my flight and made my way through security with plenty of time to spare. Sitting at the gate, I finally had a moment to process what I'd just done. Relief washed over me first. For the first time in days, I wasn't dreading the next argument, complaint, or passive-aggressive comment. I didn't have to worry about whether my plans would be met with eye rolls or whether my siblings would find yet another way to act entitled. But as the relief settled, guilt began to creep in. Was I overreacting? Leaving them a note and sneaking off in the early hours of the morning felt dramatic, even for me. What if they woke up panicked, unsure of what to do without me? Then I remembered the catamaran fiasco, the constant complaints, and the way they'd treated me like an endless source of money and entertainment. I wasn't running away. I was setting a boundary. When my flight was finally called, I boarded with a sense of purpose. I wasn't just going home. I was reclaiming my peace. The flight itself was a blur. I alternated between staring out the window at the endless blue expanse of the Pacific and imagining my family's reaction when they found the note. Would they be angry? Hurt? Embarrassed? Part of me hoped this would be a wake-up call for them, a moment of reckoning that forced them to confront their entitlement. But another part of me suspected they'd just blame me for ruining the trip. Either way, I was done carrying the weight of their expectations. By the time I landed back home, my emotions were all over the place. Relief, guilt, and a tiny spark of triumph swirled together in my chest. I couldn't deny that a part of me felt empowered by what I'd done. For the first time in a long time, I put myself first. Once I got home, I dropped my bags in the hallway and collapsed onto the couch, the familiar surroundings bringing a wave of comfort. I thought about texting my family to let them know I'd arrived safely, but I decided against it. They'd figure things out soon enough, and I needed some time to myself before dealing with the inevitable fallout. I ordered takeout, took a long shower, and spent the evening doing absolutely nothing. It was glorious. As I lay in bed that night, I felt a sense of calm I hadn't experienced in years. For the first time in days, I wasn't consumed by frustration or resentment. Instead, I felt free. The fallout was coming, I knew that much. But for now, I allowed myself to bask in the quiet satisfaction of knowing I'd taken control of my own happiness. Whatever happened next, I was ready for it. By the time I woke up the next morning, my phone was already buzzing like a swarm of angry bees. The notifications stacked up on my lock screen. Missed calls, voicemails, and texts, all from my family. I sighed, rolling over in bed and staring at the glowing screen. I had expected some kind of reaction when they found my note, but I wasn't prepared for the sheer volume of their outrage. The first text I opened was from my mom. It read, "I can't believe you just left. How could you do this to your own family? You're so selfish." Next was my dad's text. "I don't know what you were thinking, abandoning us like that. You've ruined this entire trip." Ruined it? My siblings' messages were less coherent, but no less furious. Lisa sent a string of furious emojis, punctuated by a curt, "Wow. Way to be dramatic. We needed you here." Ryan's text was even shorter. "Seriously? What the hell?" At first, I ignored them. I wasn't in the mood to get dragged into an argument, and frankly, I needed a break from their negativity. I spent the morning enjoying the peace and quiet of my own space, sipping coffee and catching up on a show I hadn't had time to watch before the trip. But they didn't let up. By midday, the messages had escalated. My mom sent a voicemail, her voice dripping with exasperation. "We don't even know what to do right now. You just abandoned us without warning. We're stranded here with no plan, no money. How could you do this to us? Lisa followed up with a guilt trip text that nearly made me laugh out loud. You've completely ruined this vacation for everyone. Do you even care about this family? Or are you just trying to make a point? It was Ryan's message that finally broke my resolve. He texted, "How could you do this to us? We have no money." I couldn't resist replying. "I left you with a fully paid resort stay and cash at the front desk." I texted back. "Figure it out." Lisa replied almost instantly. "That's not the point. You were supposed to be here with us. What kind of person just bails on their family?" I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself before responding. "The kind of person who got tired of being treated like a personal ATM and vacation planner," I wrote. "You've all spent this entire trip complaining, criticizing, and acting like I owe you something. I'm done." For a moment, there was silence. Then the group chat exploded. "Lisa, we weren't complaining. We were just giving feedback. You're being so sensitive. Mom, you've misunderstood everything. We were just trying to make the trip better for everyone. Dad, you should have talked to us instead of running away like a child." I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it all. Feedback? Making the trip better? Were they serious? By the end of the day, the messages had shifted from anger to panic. My mom texted, "What are we supposed to do now? We can't just sit around the resort all week. What if we run out of cash?" Lisa chimed in, "You should at least send more money if you're not coming back. We still have things we want to do." I stared at my phone in disbelief. Send more money? Were they kidding? I replied, "I've already paid for everything. If you've burned through the cash I left, that's on you. Maybe you should try enjoying the free activities at the resort." Ryan texted back, "This is so messed up. You could have at least given us more notice." "Notice for what?" I shot back. "So you could complain even more before I left?" Over the next few days, their messages became increasingly desperate. My mom tried calling me multiple times, leaving voicemails that ranged from tearful pleas to guilt-laden rants. "I don't know what's gotten into you," she said in one voicemail. "You're acting like we're the bad guys here. We're your family. We should be sticking together, not tearing each other apart." Lisa sent a long-winded text about how I was making everything harder than it needed to be and how I'd ruined what could have been an amazing trip. Ryan stayed quieter, though he occasionally sent snarky one-liners like, "Thanks for abandoning us, dude." I didn't respond to most of their messages. What was the point? They clearly weren't interested in taking accountability for their behavior, and I wasn't about to let them drag me back into their web of entitlement. Meanwhile, I was thriving. I spent my days catching up on sleep, binge-watching my favorite shows, and even starting to plan a solo trip for myself, one where I wouldn't have to deal with anyone else's complaints. For the first time in years, I felt like I was living life on my own terms. But as satisfying as it was to reclaim my peace, a part of me couldn't help wondering how long it would take my family to realize the full extent of their behavior. Would they ever admit they'd been wrong? Or would they just blame me for the rest of their lives? Only time would tell, but one thing was certain. I wasn't going back. The fallout had begun, and I was more than ready to see how it played out. The first few days after I left Tahiti were an odd combination of serene and surreal. On the one hand, I was finally free from the constant complaints and entitlement that had plagued the trip. On the other, my phone felt like a ticking time bomb, vibrating with every incoming message from my family. At first, their texts were more of the same: anger, guilt trips, and accusations. But as the reality of their situation set in, the tone shifted dramatically. By day 2, the anger gave way to panic, and I could almost hear the desperation in their words. "Mom, we're running out of money. What are we supposed to do? Lisa, I can't believe you just left us like this. How are we supposed to enjoy the trip without you paying for everything? Ryan, I had my heart set on the jet ski tour. Thanks for ruining it." I couldn't help but laugh at Ryan's text. Of course, the jet ski tour was still his top priority. It was almost impressive how oblivious he was to the bigger picture. Meanwhile, I was thriving. After months of planning and days of enduring my family's ungrateful attitudes, I was finally able to focus on myself. I slept in late, enjoyed leisurely mornings with coffee and my favorite breakfast pastries, and even visited my favorite coffee shop for the first time in weeks. The peace was intoxicating. No one was nagging me about what to do next or complaining that my plans weren't good enough. For the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe. I started thinking about what my next adventure might look like. One where I didn't have to cater to anyone else's whims. Maybe a solo hiking trip in the mountains, or a city tour with no itinerary except my own. The possibilities felt endless, and the idea of reclaiming travel as something joyful and restorative, rather than draining, was a revelation. Back in Tahiti, however, the chaos was in full swing. By the third day, my mom's texts had gone from passive-aggressive to downright frantic. "Mom, we can't keep this up. The resort is charging for everything, and the cash you left barely covered a few meals. What are we supposed to do?" I couldn't resist replying. "I left you enough to get through the week if you're careful. If you've blown through it, that's on you." Her response came almost instantly. "Careful? Do you know how expensive things are here? And what about activities? We can't just sit in the bungalow all day." I stared at the message, shaking my head. It was incredible how they still managed to make their situation sound like my fault. Ryan chimed in with his own complaints, of course. "Ryan, this sucks. I wanted to do the jet ski tour, but now I can't because you bailed on us." I replied, "That's not my problem, Ryan. Maybe next time, don't treat the person funding your vacation like an ATM." Lisa wasn't much better. Her texts were a mix of guilt-tripping and blaming me for ruining the vibe. "Lisa, you're acting like we were so horrible to you, but we were just trying to have fun. Maybe if you hadn't been so uptight, this trip would have been better." I decided not to reply to her. There was no point in engaging with someone who still couldn't see their own behavior for what it was. Despite their growing panic, I didn't feel guilty. I'd made sure they weren't completely stranded. The resort was paid for, and I'd left cash with the front desk to cover basic expenses. If they'd spent it all on unnecessary extras, that was their own doing. The thought of them sitting in the bungalow, trying to figure out what to do next, was oddly satisfying. For years, I'd been the one to clean up their messes and make their lives easier. Now, they had no choice but to fend for themselves. Meanwhile, I was making the most of my newfound freedom. I treated myself to a spa day, went for long walks, and even started planning my next trip. I couldn't stop smiling at the thought of traveling solo, free from anyone else's demands or complaints. By the end of the week, the messages from my family had slowed down. Either they'd finally accepted their situation, or they'd decided I wasn't worth the effort anymore. Either way, I was relieved. One final text from my mom summed up their mood perfectly. "We're coming home soon. I hope you're happy." I didn't reply. For the first time in a long time, I was happy, and nothing they said or did was going to take that away from me. It had been a week since I returned home from Tahiti, and life was finally settling back into a peaceful routine. My family's frantic texts and voicemails had slowed to a trickle, replaced by a strained silence that I wasn't in a rush to break. I was fine with the quiet. After everything that had happened, I needed the space to heal, reflect, and enjoy the solitude I'd fought so hard to reclaim. So, when my phone buzzed one afternoon and my dad's name popped up on the screen, I hesitated before answering. My dad wasn't one to call unless it was important, and given how the last week had gone, I wasn't sure I was ready to hear whatever he had to say. But curiosity got the better of me, and I picked up. "Hey," I said cautiously. There was a brief pause on the other end before he spoke. "We're back," he said, his voice quieter than usual. And I wanted to say I'm sorry. For everything. I almost dropped my phone. My dad wasn't the apologizing type. He was more likely to brush things under the rug or use humor to deflect awkward conversations. Hearing him admit fault outright was both shocking and disarming. "I didn't expect to hear that," I said honestly. He sighed heavily, as though the weight of the last week had finally caught up with him. "Look, I've had a lot of time to think about what happened. We messed up. All of us. The way we treated you on that trip was unfair, and leaving you to feel like you had to walk away. That's on us. I'm sorry." The sincerity in his voice caught me off guard. For days, I'd braced myself for more blame, more excuses, more of the same entitlement I'd dealt with on the trip. But this was unexpected. I didn't know what to say at first. Part of me wanted to vent my frustration, to unload every ounce of anger and hurt I'd been carrying since the trip began. But another part of me recognized the vulnerability in his apology and didn't want to shut it down. "I appreciate you saying that," I said finally. "It means a lot. But it wasn't just you, Dad. It was everyone. And honestly, I don't think any of you realized how much pressure I was under until it was too late." He didn't argue. "You're right," he said. "We didn't see it. We were so focused on what we wanted that we didn't stop to think about how hard you were working to make everything perfect for us. That was selfish, and I'm sorry for that too." Hearing him take responsibility felt like a weight lifting off my shoulders. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel like I had to defend myself or justify my actions. "What happened after I left?" I asked, curious about their side of the story. Dad let out a dry laugh. "Let's just say it wasn't the vacation we imagined. Your mom panicked when she read your note, and Lisa and Ryan were furious. But once the initial shock wore off, we had to figure out how to get through the rest of the trip without you. It wasn't easy. I could almost picture them sitting in the bungalow, scrambling to piece together a plan without my help. Did you manage? I asked. Barely, he admitted. We stayed at the resort most of the time. The cash you left helped, but we had to be careful with it. We definitely learned how to appreciate the little things, something I think we'd forgotten how to do. His tone softened. It gave us a lot of time to think about how we treated you. And the more we talked about it, the more we realized how wrong we were. You didn't deserve any of that, and we should have been more grateful. For the first time, I felt like my family might actually understand what I'd been through. Still, I wasn't ready to forgive and forget entirely. It's good that you realize that now, I said carefully. But it doesn't change the fact that what happened hurt me. It's going to take time to rebuild that trust. I understand, Dad said. And I'm not asking you to forgive us right away. I just wanted to let you know that we're sorry and that we want to make it up to you. How? I asked, skeptical but curious. We're still figuring that out, he admitted. But we're not going to take you for granted anymore. That's a promise. After we hung up, I sat with my thoughts for a while. The conversation had been unexpected, but it gave me a glimmer of hope. Maybe my family wasn't beyond redemption after all. I wasn't ready to jump back into things with open arms, but for the first time in weeks, I felt like there was a path forward. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight, but I was willing to see where it led. In the meantime, I continued to enjoy the peace and quiet of my own life, something I'd come to value more than ever. And no matter what happened, I knew one thing for certain. I would never let myself be taken for granted again. The conversation with my dad had been a turning point, but it was far from a magical fix. The wounds from the Tahiti trip were still fresh, and I knew it would take more than a single apology to undo the damage. But it was a start, and that was enough to give me a shred of cautious optimism. Over the next few weeks, my family kept their word. For the first time in what felt like forever, they didn't ask me for anything. No money, no favors, no planning their next vacation. Instead, they focused on rebuilding our relationship. My mom, who had always been the queen of passive-aggressive guilt trips, surprised me with a text that said, "Thank you for everything you did for us in Tahiti. We didn't deserve it, and I'm sorry for how we treated you." It wasn't perfect, but it felt genuine, and that meant a lot. Rebuilding trust wasn't easy, though. Every time they called or texted, I found myself bracing for the other shoe to drop, expecting them to slide back into their old habits. But slowly their behavior began to shift. Lisa, who had been the most vocal complainer on the trip, started checking in with me in a way that felt less self-centered. "Hey, how's work going?" she asked in one text. "I saw this article about your industry and thought of you." I almost didn't know how to respond. Was she really just being thoughtful? Even Ryan, who had spent most of the vacation glued to his phone or whining about jet skis, made an effort. He called me one evening, completely out of the blue. "I just wanted to say thanks for everything you did for us," he said awkwardly. I know I wasn't exactly great company on the trip. I let out a small laugh, surprised by his honesty. "That's an understatement," I said, but there was no malice in my tone. "I appreciate you saying that, though." The real challenge came when my family started talking about future plans. My mom floated the idea of a holiday reunion, something low-key at home instead of a big trip. "We'll keep it simple," she promised. "No fancy hotels or extravagant activities. Just family time." The old me would have jumped in, eager to coordinate everything and make it perfect. But this time I held back. "That sounds nice," I said carefully. "But I think you should take the lead on planning it." To my surprise, she agreed without hesitation. "Of course," she said. "You've done more than enough. This one's on us." Hearing that was like a breath of fresh air. For so long, I'd been the default organizer, the one who carried the weight of everyone's expectations. Letting them take responsibility felt like a step in the right direction, not just for me, but for all of us. As the weeks turned into months, I started to feel more comfortable setting boundaries. When Lisa casually mentioned a destination wedding she wanted to attend in the Caribbean, I didn't even flinch. "That sounds amazing," I said. "I hope you have a great time." "You're not coming?" she asked, sounding surprised. "Probably not," I said. "I've got other plans, and besides, it sounds like your thing, not mine." She didn't argue or guilt-trip me. Instead, she just said, "Fair enough," and moved on. It was a small moment, but it felt monumental. In the process of redefining my relationship with my family, I also learned a lot about myself. I realized that I had spent years tying my self-worth to how much I could do for others, constantly seeking validation through my generosity. But now I was learning to put myself first, to travel for my own enjoyment, to set limits without feeling guilty, and to say no when something didn't serve me. It wasn't easy. There were moments when I doubted myself, wondering if I was being too harsh or selfish. But those moments were fleeting, quickly replaced by a sense of relief and freedom. Eventually, my family and I found a new balance. We still had our disagreements. No family is perfect, but the entitlement and resentment that had once defined our interactions began to fade. They learned to appreciate me for who I was, not for what I could provide. And I learned that it was okay to step back, to let them fend for themselves instead of always swooping in to save the day. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was real. And for the first time in years, I felt like we were finally on the same page. Rebuilding trust takes time, but it's worth the effort when the people on the other side are willing to meet you halfway. And for my family, that was a lesson we all needed to learn. Looking back on everything, leaving my family in Tahiti felt less like a dramatic escape and more like a turning point, a moment that finally taught us all a lesson we desperately needed to learn. For years, I'd let myself be the one who always said yes, the one who smoothed over conflicts, handled logistics, and picked up the tab without question. And for years, my family had taken that for granted. Walking away wasn't just about escaping the complaints and entitlement that had consumed our vacation. It was about breaking the cycle. It forced them to confront their own behavior, to realize that my generosity wasn't infinite and that their actions had consequences. And it forced me to confront my own boundaries, or lack thereof, and to understand that saying no isn't selfish, it's necessary. Would I ever do it again? Probably not. But that's because I've learned how to set limits long before things reach a breaking point. The fallout from Tahiti rippled through our family dynamic in ways I didn't expect. Over time, I noticed subtle changes in how my family treated me. They stopped assuming I'd foot the bill for every outing or vacation, and they started asking instead of demanding. When we did make plans, they offered to contribute, not just financially, but by helping to organize and plan. The shift wasn't immediate, and there were still moments where old habits tried to creep back in. Lisa once joked about how nice it would be if I treated everyone to another tropical getaway, and I didn't hesitate to shut that down. If you want a tropical getaway, Lisa, start saving for one, I said with a smile. She laughed it off, but she didn't bring it up again. The real test came when my mom suggested another family trip, this time to a cabin in the mountains. She pitched it as a low-key, low-cost getaway, just hiking, board games, and simple meals cooked together. We'll all chip in this time, she added quickly, as if reading my mind. It won't be like last time. I promise. I hesitated, unsure if I was ready to dive back into the chaos of a family vacation. But the fact that she acknowledged how things had gone wrong before, and was actively trying to avoid a repeat, meant something. All right, I said cautiously, but I'm holding you to that promise. The trip wasn't perfect, but it was a far cry from the disaster in Tahiti. Everyone pitched in, and no one treated me like their personal assistant. It was a reminder that while people can change, those changes take time and effort, and a willingness to confront the uncomfortable truths about themselves. As for me, I've embraced the freedom of solo travel. There's something incredibly liberating about planning trips for yourself, where the only expectations you have to meet are your own. I've hiked through national parks, explored bustling cities, and spent lazy afternoons on beaches without worrying about anyone else's complaints or demands. Travel has become something joyful again, something I do for myself, not as an act of service for others. And that's a lesson I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. You don't have to sacrifice your own happiness to make others happy, especially when they don't appreciate it. If I do travel with my family again, it will be on my terms. They'll need to pay their own way, contribute equally, and treat me like a fellow traveler, not a bank or a tour guide. Until then, I'm perfectly content planning my own adventures, knowing that I've reclaimed my time, my energy, and my sense of self. Leaving them in Tahiti was bold, yes, but it was also the best decision I've ever made. It taught me the power of boundaries and the importance of standing up for myself, even when it feels uncomfortable. In the end, I didn't just leave behind a bad vacation. I left behind years of resentment, unspoken expectations, and the fear of saying no. And honestly, that feels like the greatest escape of all.